"They're going to kill us." The words echoed in her mind like a death sentence. But the rancher whispered something that night, something that froze her blood and changed everything forever. The terror that followed would test not just their survival instincts, but the very limits of human courage. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. The shrill laughter of outlaws shattered the silence across the Texas plains, echoing through the makeshift camp like the howls of coyotes. Mary Johnson lay helpless on the dirt floor, her body curled into itself as if trying to disappear entirely. The filthy towel she clutched to her bruised form was all that remained of her dignity, a pathetic shield against the horrors she had endured over the past week. The camp reeked of whiskey and unwashed bodies. Firelight cast grotesque shadows across the faces of their captors, men who had abandoned any semblance of humanity. Their raucous voices grew louder with each bottle emptied, their eyes increasingly predatory as they glanced toward the corner where the women were kept. Beside Mary, Jennifer Smith shifted painfully, trying to find a position that wouldn't aggravate her raw, bleeding wrists. The ropes that had bound her for days had cut deep into her flesh, leaving angry red circles that throbbed with each heartbeat. Her once vibrant spirit seemed dimmed now, like a lantern running out of oil. "They're going to kill us," Mary whispered, her voice barely audible above the crackling fire and drunken shouts. The words hung in the stifling night air, heavy with terrible truth. Jennifer turned to look at her friend. In the flickering light, Mary's face appeared ghostly, her eyes sunken and haunted. The bruises on her cheek had turned a sickly yellow-purple, testament to the brutality they had faced since being taken from the stagecoach 3 days ago. Something shifted in Jennifer's gaze, a hardening, a resolve forming behind the fear. She glanced toward the outlaws, counting silently. 5 men, all armed, but 3 were already stumbling drunk. The leader with the distinctive scar was nowhere to be seen, likely passed out in his tent after claiming his share of the whiskey. "Not if we don't let them," Jennifer whispered back, her cracked lips barely moving. Mary's eyes widened in disbelief. "How? We can't." "We have to," Jennifer interrupted, a desperate courage igniting within her. She slowly uncurled her fingers, revealing a small, jagged piece of metal she had worked loose from a buckle. "I've been working on these ropes all day." For the first time in days, a flicker of hope crossed Mary's battered face. Outside, an owl called into the darkness, its mournful cry seeming to echo their plight. But beneath the terror and pain, something else was taking root, a fierce determination that neither woman knew they possessed until this moment. When survival became the only option, desperation ignited something primal in Jennifer Smith. Her fingers closed around a jagged rock, its rough edges cutting into her palm as she clutched it with white-knuckled determination. The outlaw loomed above her, his breath reeking of whiskey and tobacco, completely unaware of the fury building within his captive. In one explosive movement, Jennifer swung upward, channeling every ounce of her remaining strength into the blow. The rock connected with his temple with a sickening thud. For a moment, time seemed suspended. His eyes widened in shock, the cruel sneer frozen on his face. Then, like a marionette with cut strings, he crumpled to the earth, a trickle of blood seeping from beneath his matted hair. "Mary," Jennifer whispered urgently, scrambling toward her friend. Mary Johnson remained curled in a protective ball, clutching the filthy towel around her bruised body. Her eyes were vacant, haunted by days of unimaginable horror. "He's down. We have to go now." Jennifer's voice cracked as she pulled Mary to her feet. The older woman swayed unsteadily, her legs weak from abuse and confinement. Together they stumbled into the Texas night, the tall grass whispering against their legs as they fled. Every step was agony on their bare feet. Sharp stones sliced their soles, while thorny plants tore at their ankles, leaving thin trails of blood in their wake. The brittle grass crackled beneath them, each sound amplified by their terror. "I can't," Mary gasped after they'd covered barely 50 yards, her breath coming in ragged bursts. "They'll catch us." Jennifer gripped her friend's arm tighter. "We keep moving or we die," she hissed, her determination unwavering despite the tremor in her voice. Just a little further. Behind them, shouts erupted from the outlaw camp. A lantern flared to life, casting long shadows across the plains. Men's voices, angry and alarmed, carried through the still night air. "The women! Find them!" Mary sobbed quietly, but kept moving, leaning heavily against Jennifer. Each footfall was a battle against exhaustion and despair. The vast Texas wilderness stretched before them, offering both salvation and peril in equal measure. Moonlight silvered the landscape, providing just enough illumination to avoid the deepest pitfalls, but nowhere near enough to feel safe. "If we make it to dawn," Jennifer whispered, "we might find help." Mary didn't respond, focusing entirely on placing one foot before the other. Blood and dirt mingled on their skin as they pushed forward, driven by the most fundamental human instinct, survival. Behind them, the voices grew more distant, then louder again as the search pattern shifted. The night seemed endless, their freedom as fragile as a candle flame in a storm. Pinpricks of orange light dotted the horizon like malevolent stars. Mary Johnson's eyes widened with terror as she watched the distant campfires grow brighter, the outlaw shouts carrying across the Texas plains on the night breeze. "They know we're gone," she whispered, her voice breaking. The realization hit her like a physical blow. Mary stumbled, her bare foot catching on an exposed root, and she would have fallen if not for Jennifer's steady grip. "They'll find us," Mary sobbed, leaning heavily against her friend's shoulder. Her body, already weak from days of captivity, threatened to give out entirely. Every shadow in the tall grass seemed to hide one of Michael's men, waiting to drag them back to that hell. Jennifer Smith tightened her hold around Mary's waist, ignoring the burning pain in her own raw wrists where the ropes had cut deep. "Not if we keep moving," she insisted, her voice low but fierce. "Not if we don't stop." The words trembled in the darkness between them, but Jennifer's eyes reflected something the outlaws hadn't managed to extinguish, a stubborn, defiant flame that refused to die. She pulled Mary forward through another patch of brittle grass, wincing as sharp edges sliced at their exposed ankles. Behind them, a man's voice rose above the others. That slow, talking pandemic expression, deliberate drawl that Jennifer would recognize anywhere. The leader was organizing search parties. Mary whimpered at the sound, and Jennifer felt her friend's resolve wavering. "Listen to me," Jennifer whispered, stopping just long enough to grip Mary's shoulders. "We didn't survive everything they did to us just to give up now." A distant shout, closer than before, sent fresh panic coursing through them. The outlaws were spreading out, combing the plains. Jennifer could almost feel their pursuit like a physical weight pressing against her back. Exhaustion gnawed at her muscles, turning her limbs to lead. Each step became a battle of will against the desperate need to collapse. The cool night air stung their lungs as they pushed forward, guided only by starlight and the desperate need to put distance between themselves and the camp. "I can't," Mary gasped, her legs buckling. "Please, I need to rest." Jennifer glanced back at the flickering lights, now dispersing as riders fanned out across the terrain. "Just a little further," she urged, though her own body screamed for relief. "We need to find somewhere to hide before dawn." They pressed on, two broken women against the vast Texas wilderness, their footprints trailing behind them like a map leading straight to their desperate flight. But with each painful step, the campfires grew dimmer, and something else flickered to life, the faintest spark of hope that they might actually survive the night. The endless Texas plains stretched before them, moonlight painting their bruised and bloodied faces with ghostly pallor. Jennifer Smith gripped Mary's trembling hand as they stumbled forward, their bare feet raw and blistered from hours of desperate flight. The vast emptiness surrounding them was both blessing and curse. Nowhere to hide, but no landmarks to guide their escape either. "Just a little further," Jennifer whispered, though she had no destination in mind. Her words hung in the cool night air, a fragile promise she wasn't sure she could keep. Mary Johnson nodded weakly, her eyes glazed with exhaustion. The towel she'd clutched since their escape was now wrapped around her shoulders, a pitiful shield against the chill that had settled over the Texas wilderness. Every few steps, she would stumble, leaning more heavily against her friend. "Do you think they're still following us?" Mary asked, her voice barely audible above the whisper of prairie grass bending in the night breeze. Jennifer paused, listening intently. The distant howl of a coyote was the only answer. "I don't know," she admitted, "but we can't stop. Not yet." They pushed onward, two broken figures against the endless horizon. The moon tracked their progress across the sky, casting long shadows that seemed to reach for them like grasping fingers. Jennifer's determination never wavered, even as her own strength began to fail. The resilience that had sparked their escape still burned within her, though dimmer now as exhaustion took its toll. Hours blurred together, fear and determination propelling them forward through the night. Jennifer tried to focus on anything but the pain. Counting stars, watching for the first hint of dawn, planning what they would do if they somehow survived this nightmare. When Mary finally collapsed, unable to take another step, Jennifer knelt at her side, torn between dragging her friend onward or risking everything by staying hidden in the tall grass. The prairie plants rose around them, offering meager concealment. "I can't," Mary sobbed, her body shaking uncontrollably. "I just can't go any further." Jennifer surveyed their surroundings, calculating their chances. The outlaws would be searching at first light. Without shelter or weapons, they were desperately vulnerable. Yet, forcing Mary to continue seemed equally impossible. "Just a few minutes," Jennifer finally conceded, helping her friend into a more comfortable position among the grass. "We'll rest, then keep moving." Mary nodded gratefully, her eyes already closing as exhaustion claimed her. Jennifer remained vigilant, scanning the horizon for any sign of pursuit, one hand resting protectively on Mary's shoulder. The vast Texas landscape offered no comfort, only the terrible knowledge that somewhere out there, men with cruel intentions were hunting them. It was then that the sound of hooves thundered through the quiet, sending a fresh wave of terror through the women's hearts. Mary Johnson clutched Jennifer's arm, her fingers digging into flesh already marked with bruises and cuts. The rhythmic pounding grew louder, echoing across the empty Texas plains like a death knell. "They found us," Mary whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of approaching danger. Her entire body trembled as she pressed the filthy towel tighter against herself. Jennifer Smith rose to her knees, searching the darkness for somewhere to hide. But the moonlit prairie offered no shelter, no escape. The tall grass that had concealed them now seemed woefully inadequate. Her bleeding wrists stung as she pushed herself up, determined to face whatever came with what little dignity remained. From the darkness emerged a tall horse, its coat gleaming silver in the moonlight. Atop the animal sat Robert Davis, a rancher whose steely eyes carried the weight of past battles. His silhouette against the night sky was broad and imposing, the outline of a man hardened by life on the frontier. "Please," Jennifer called out, her voice stronger than she felt, "don't hurt us." Robert studied the two women from atop his mount, noting their torn clothing and the fear etched into their faces. He'd seen that look before. During the war, the hollow-eyed stare of those who'd witnessed horrors no person should endure. The rancher dismounted with practiced ease, his boots sinking into the dry Texas dirt as he approached. He moved slowly, deliberately, like a man accustomed to calming spooked animals. His weathered face remained impassive, but something flickered behind his eyes. Recognition, perhaps, of suffering he understood too well. "You're running from someone," he stated rather than asked, keeping a respectful distance. Mary cowered behind Jennifer, who managed to stand despite her exhaustion. "We escaped," she answered, chin raised despite her trembling limbs. "From men who took us." Robert nodded once, understanding immediately. He saw that they had suffered horrors too deep for words, but something in their eyes, a fierce determination beneath the fear, demanded his help. It reminded him of comrades who'd fought beside him, refusing to surrender even when death seemed certain. "My ranch is 3 miles east," he said, gesturing toward the horizon. "You'll find safety there." Jennifer hesitated, studying the stranger's face for any sign of deception. Trust had become a luxury they couldn't afford. Yet the alternative was certain death if the outlaws found them. "Why would you help us?" she asked, her voice cracking with exhaustion. Robert's gaze drifted briefly to the distant darkness, as though searching for ghosts only he could see. "Because," he said simply, "some debts can never be repaid." "Please help us," Jennifer Smith pleaded, her voice cracking with exhaustion. The words hung in the air between them, raw and desperate. Robert Davis reached for the battered canteen hanging from his saddle. The metal was worn smooth from years of use, dented in places that told stories of hard rides across the Texas plains. He unscrewed the cap and offered it without a word. Jennifer took the canteen with trembling hands, her wrists still bearing the angry red marks where ropes had cut into her flesh. She didn't drink immediately. Instead, she turned to Mary Johnson, who sat slumped beside her, clutching the filthy towel around her body like armor. "Here, Mary," Jennifer whispered, supporting her friend's head as she helped her drink. Water spilled down Mary's chin, but she gulped desperately, her eyes closed. The rancher watched as Jennifer tended to Mary first, despite her own obvious thirst and pain. Only after Mary had drunk her fill did Jennifer raise the canteen to her own lips. She drank slowly, deliberately, never taking her eyes off Robert. Trust didn't come easily after what they'd endured. Robert knelt in the dirt, keeping a respectful distance. The moonlight cast long shadows across the plains, illuminating the women's injuries in stark relief. Mary's face was swollen, one eye nearly shut, while Jennifer's arms were a map of bruises and cuts. Yet there was something in her gaze, a fierce determination that hadn't been broken. "My ranch is about 3 miles east," he said, his voice low and steady. "You'll be safe there." Jennifer wiped her mouth with the back of her hand. "How do we know we can trust you?" A fair question. Robert had asked himself the same many times over the years. The war had changed him, left him with nightmares that still woke him in cold sweats. He'd seen men at their worst, had been one of them, once. As he studied their faces, a single question burned in Robert's mind, one that had haunted him for years. Would saving these broken souls finally bring him redemption, or would it drag him into a darkness from which he might never escape? The rancher stood slowly, careful not to make any sudden movements. "You don't know," he admitted, "but staying out here means certain death. Those men won't stop looking." Jennifer's eyes flashed with fear at the mention of their pursuers, but she nodded, helping Mary to her feet. The injured woman swayed dangerously, and Robert stepped forward, offering his arm for support. "I've got her," Jennifer said quickly, pulling Mary closer. Robert nodded, understanding their caution. "My horse can carry you both," he said, turning toward his mount. "I'll walk alongside." It wasn't much, this small offer of help, but it was a beginning. Perhaps for all of them. Mary Johnson clutched the tattered towel against her body with trembling hands, as if it were the last barrier between her dignity. Her entire frame shook uncontrollably, eyes darting around the unfamiliar surroundings of Robert's modest wooden home. The flickering lamplight cast long shadows across her bruised face, highlighting the marks of abuse that told a story no woman should ever have to tell. Robert Davis knelt beside her, his weathered hands hovering uncertainly, afraid that any touch might shatter her completely. The rancher had seen his share of broken souls during his time as a soldier, but there was something about Mary's quiet suffering that pierced through his carefully constructed defenses. "You're safe here," he said, his voice low and steady. "No one's going to hurt you anymore." Jennifer Smith sat nearby, her posture a stark contrast to her friend's. Despite her bleeding wrists and the dirt caked into her skin, she maintained a rigid spine and lifted chin. The determined woman's eyes never left Robert, studying his every movement with the wariness of someone who had learned the hard price of trust. "How do we know that?" Jennifer challenged, though exhaustion threaded through her words. "How do we know you're not one of them?" Robert reached for his canteen, offering it first to Mary, who accepted with shaking hands. "I'm not asking you to trust me," he replied. "Just let me help you both get through tonight." The rancher moved to stoke the small fire in the hearth, the familiar routine giving his hands purpose while his mind wrestled with unwelcome memories. He recognized the hollow look in their eyes. He'd seen it in fellow soldiers, in prisoners, in himself during darker days. War had taught him about fear, about the way it could hollow a person from the inside out, but something about these women's suffering struck deeper. Mary sipped water slowly, her gaze fixed on the wooden floorboards. "They'll come looking," she whispered, her first words since arriving at the ranch. "Let them," Robert answered, a hardness entering his voice that made Jennifer glance up sharply. Something stirred in the rancher's chest, a protective instinct he thought had died years ago on blood-soaked battlefields. These women had fought their own war, had survived against impossible odds. Their courage, especially Jennifer's fierce determination to protect her friend, awakened something long dormant in him. As Robert moved to check the windows, securing the latches with practiced hands, he made a silent vow. Whatever demons from his past haunted him, whatever connection existed between him and the monsters who had hurt these women, he would stand between them and any further harm, even if it meant confronting the darkness in his own blood. Jennifer Smith straightened her back despite the pain radiating through her body. The flickering lamplight cast long shadows across the wooden floor as she gathered her courage. Robert had offered them safety, but she needed him to understand the danger that followed them. "These aren't just any outlaws," she began, her voice steadier than she expected. "Their leader has a scar down his cheek, from his eye to his jaw, and when he talks, it's slow, like every word weighs a ton." Her fingers unconsciously traced a line down her own face. "I'll never forget that voice. It haunts me even now." Robert Davis felt as though the ground had fallen away beneath him. The description hit him like a physical blow. The scar, that distinctive, measured way of speaking. His weathered hands gripped the edge of the table until his knuckles turned white. He knew the scar. He knew that voice. It belonged to his own brother, Michael Davis, a truth that burned inside him like wildfire. Mary shifted uncomfortably on her chair, clutching the tattered towel tighter around herself. She noticed the rancher's sudden pallor, the way his shoulders tensed beneath his worn shirt. "You know him," she whispered, not a question, but a realization. Robert turned away, unable to meet their eyes. The weight of his secret pressed down on him like the Texas sun at midday. How could he tell these broken women that the monster who had tormented them shared his blood, that the same hands that had taught him to ride and shoot now inflicted suffering on the innocent? "I've heard stories," he finally managed, the lie bitter on his tongue. Those outlaws have been terrorizing folks across 3 counties. Jennifer studied his face carefully. The former soldier wasn't telling them everything. She could sense it in the tightness around his eyes, the careful neutrality of his expression. But she was too exhausted, too grateful for the momentary safety to press further. "They'll come looking," she said instead, her gaze drifting toward the window and the vast darkness beyond. "They always do." Robert nodded, his mind racing with impossible choices: blood against conscience, family against humanity. The burden of his brother's sins felt heavier than any rifle he'd carried during the war. "You're safe here," he promised, though he wondered if anyone could truly be safe with Michael on their trail. The outlaw leader wouldn't stop, not when his pride was wounded, not when he considered these women his property. As Mary's eyes finally closed with exhaustion, Jennifer watched Robert move to check the locks on the doors, his movements precise and practiced. Whatever secrets this rancher harbored, she sensed they were about to surface, and when they did, none of them would emerge unscathed. Robert Davis turned away, his weathered jaw clenched tight as the terrible secret twisted in his gut like a knife. The scar, the voice, they belonged to Michael Davis, his own flesh and blood. The weight of this knowledge pressed down on him, threatening to crush his resolve. These women had suffered enough at his brother's hands. They didn't need to know about their connection. Not now, maybe not ever. The rancher stared out across the Texas plains, moonlight casting long shadows across the dry earth. Behind him, he could hear Mary Johnson's ragged breathing and Jennifer Smith's occasional whispers of comfort. The war had taught him about difficult choices, about the moments that defined a man's character. This was one such moment. "Your brother did this?" The question hung in the air, unasked but hovering between them like gunsmoke. Robert squared his shoulders and turned back to face the women. Mary clutched her filthy towel tighter, her eyes wide with exhaustion and fear. Jennifer sat beside her, protective despite her own bleeding wrists and bruised face. Their resilience in the face of such brutality stirred something long dormant inside him. "Come on," Robert said, his voice steady and low as he offered his calloused hand to them. Years of ranch work had hardened his palm, but there was gentleness in his gesture. "You're safe now. My ranch isn't far from here." For the first time since he'd found them, a flicker of hope sparked in Mary's eyes. She glanced at Jennifer, seeking reassurance, permission perhaps. The bond between the 2 women was evident, forged in shared suffering and desperate escape. "Can we trust him?" Mary's whisper carried on the night breeze. Jennifer studied the rancher's face, searching for deception. Robert met her gaze steadily, allowing her to see whatever truth she needed to find there. After a long moment, she nodded. "I think we can," she replied, reaching for Robert's outstretched hand. He helped Jennifer to her feet first, noting how she winced but refused to cry out. Then Mary, who seemed lighter than a child as he lifted her from the ground. The towel slipped slightly, and she clutched at it desperately, the last remnant of her dignity. "I have a horse waiting just over that rise," Robert explained, pointing toward a cluster of mesquite trees. Offering sanctuary meant standing against his brother, against the outlaw Michael had become, blood against blood. But watching these women struggle forward, determined despite their pain, he knew he'd made the only choice a man of honor could make. Jennifer Smith hesitated, eyeing Robert's outstretched hand with suspicion born from days of torment. Trust had become a luxury she could no longer afford. Yet something in the rancher's steady gaze, perhaps the absence of cruelty she'd grown accustomed to, finally convinced her. She reached out, her trembling fingers meeting his calloused palm. "Come on, Mary," she whispered, helping her friend to her feet. Mary Johnson swayed dangerously, clutching the filthy towel around herself with white-knuckled desperation. The younger woman's eyes were vacant, haunted by horrors Jennifer couldn't bear to name. Robert supported Mary's weight without comment, his weathered face betraying no judgment at their battered appearance. "The horse can carry you both," he said, his voice low and steady. "I'll walk alongside." Each step toward the waiting animal was agony. Jennifer winced as thorns embedded in her bare feet drove deeper with every movement. Beside her, Mary whimpered softly, leaning heavily against the rancher's sturdy frame. "I've got you," Robert murmured, helping first Mary and then Jennifer onto the horse's back. The animal shifted beneath their unfamiliar weight, but remained calm under its master's hand. Jennifer wrapped her arms around Mary's waist, holding her friend secure as they began their slow journey across the moonlit Texas plains. Robert walked in silence, leading his mount with practiced ease. Jennifer studied him from above, the set of his shoulders, the vigilant way he scanned the horizon. He moved like a man accustomed to danger, like the soldiers she'd seen passing through town before everything went wrong. The night air grew cooler as they traveled, raising goosebumps on Jennifer's bare arms. Pain throbbed through her body in relentless waves, yet for the first time in days, fear wasn't her primary emotion. Something dangerously close to hope flickered in her chest. As they crested a gentle rise, the outline of a modest ranch materialized against the star-filled sky. A simple wooden structure stood surrounded by a rough fence, a lone lamplight glowing in one window. Nothing grand, just a humble homestead carved from the unforgiving Texas wilderness. Jennifer couldn't help the shaky laugh that escaped her lips, the sound strange even to her own ears. After endless darkness, that single light represented everything they'd been denied: shelter, safety, humanity. "Is that yours?" she asked, her voice cracking from disuse and thirst. Robert nodded. "It's not much, but you'll be safe there." Mary stirred against Jennifer, raising her head slightly. "Safe," she repeated, as though testing an unfamiliar word. Jennifer tightened her grip around her friend, tears threatening to spill. Maybe, just maybe, they had found someone willing to risk everything for them, a stranger whose kindness might prove stronger than the evil punting them across the plains. Robert's stomach knotted as he guided his horse across the Texas plains. The weight of his thoughts was heavier than the two women clinging to his back. If Michael Davis was indeed the scarred man Jennifer described, then this rescue wasn't just an act of kindness. It was a declaration of war against his own flesh and blood. The rancher stole a glance over his shoulder. Jennifer sat tall despite her injuries, one arm protectively wrapped around Mary. There was something remarkable about her, a fierce determination that shone through the dirt and blood caking her skin. She had no idea that the monster who had tormented them shared the same blood as the man now offering salvation. "How much further?" Jennifer called, her voice barely audible above the rhythmic thud of hooves against dry earth. "Not far now," Robert answered, turning back to face the horizon. His mind raced through the implications. Michael had always been trouble, even before the war changed him. Their parents had favored the elder Davis son despite his cruelties, leaving Robert to clean up the messes his brother left behind. But this, capturing women, brutalizing them, this was beyond anything he could have imagined. The horse slowed as they approached a shallow creek. Robert dismounted to let the animal drink, offering his canteen to the women. As Mary sipped gratefully, he caught Jennifer studying his face. "You've got that look," she said quietly, "like you're carrying something heavy." Robert's jaw tightened. How could he tell her? The truth would shatter the fragile trust forming between them. If Jennifer knew she was being rescued by the brother of her tormentor, would she flee into the night, dragging Mary back into danger? "Just thinking about what comes next," he replied, avoiding her perceptive gaze. The former soldier knew what Michael was capable of. His brother wouldn't let these women go without a fight. There would be blood spilled on Texas soil, perhaps Robert's own. And if it came to that final confrontation, could he truly raise his hand against his brother? "We should keep moving," he said, helping them back onto the horse. As they continued toward the ranch, Robert made a silent vow. He would protect these women, even if it meant standing against family. Some secrets were better left buried, at least until they reached safety. Tomorrow would bring its own battles, but tonight, his only mission was to get Jennifer and Mary behind the walls of his home, where he could at least offer them one night of peace before the storm that was surely coming. The journey to Robert Davis's ranch stretched through the night like a haunted dream. Jennifer Smith and Mary Johnson huddled together on the horse behind their rescuer, each jolt of the animal's gait sending fresh waves of pain through their battered bodies. The cool Texas breeze carried the scent of sage and dust, stinging the raw cuts on their skin as they rode in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Mary trembled against Jennifer's back, her fingers clutching the filthy towel around her shoulders. Jennifer kept her eyes fixed on Robert's broad shoulders, studying his posture for any sign of deception. Though he had offered them sanctuary, years of betrayal had taught her that kindness often came with hidden costs. When the simple wooden structure of the ranch house finally emerged from the darkness, Robert dismounted with practiced ease. "It's not much," he said, helping the women down, "but it's safe." Inside, oil lamps cast warm light across worn furniture and simple furnishings. The rancher moved with quiet efficiency, stoking the dying embers in the hearth until flames licked upward, chasing away the night's chill. Jennifer guided Mary to a chair near the fire, where her friend collapsed in exhaustion. "You both need to eat," Robert said, his voice low and steady as he moved to a small kitchen area. He returned with 2 bowls of beans and thick slices of bread. Plain fare, but the aroma made Jennifer's stomach clench with hunger she hadn't allowed herself to acknowledge. Mary didn't hesitate, scooping the food with trembling hands and eating with desperate intensity. The warmth of the meal brought color back to her hollow cheeks, and for a moment, she looked almost peaceful. Jennifer ate more cautiously, watching Robert as he poured water from his canteen into tin cups. His movements were measured, deliberate, those of a man accustomed to conserving energy. When he caught her staring, he didn't look away. "I know you don't trust me," he said simply. "You've got no reason to." "Why help us?" Jennifer asked, her voice stronger than she expected. "You don't know us. You're risking your life." Robert settled into a chair across from them, his weathered hands resting on his knees. Some things a man just does because they need doing. The answer wasn't enough, and they both knew it. Jennifer's eyes narrowed slightly as she studied his face, searching for hidden motives. The rancher had the look of someone carrying secrets. She recognized it because she carried her own. As Mary's eyelids grew heavy with exhaustion and relief, Jennifer remained alert, watching their host's every move. The food in her stomach and roof over her head were welcome, but she couldn't shake the feeling that their nightmare was far from over. The tense silence shattered with the creak of the front door. All 3 heads turned toward the sound, forks suspended mid-air. Heavy boots scraped against the wooden planks, each step deliberate and menacing. Jennifer Smith's blood ran cold as she recognized the figure now standing in the doorway, the same outlaw she had struck with the rock during their escape. His temple was crusted with dried blood, his face a patchwork of purple bruising, but what made her stomach clench was the pistol clutched in his white-knuckled grip. "You got something of mine, old man," he sneered, waving the gun toward the trembling women. His eyes narrowed as they locked on Jennifer, recognition flashing across his features. "This one's got fight in her. Michael's gonna want her back special." Mary gasped, shrinking behind Jennifer, the color draining from her already pale face. The towel she'd been clutching for days now trembled in her grip. But Robert Davis moved without hesitation. The rancher's weathered face betrayed no fear as he slowly rose from his chair, positioning himself between the outlaw and the women. "These ladies aren't property," Robert said, his voice steady despite the weapon pointed in his direction. "And they sure as hell aren't yours." The outlaw spat on the floor, his lips curling into a snarl. "You're making a mistake, rancher. You don't know who you're dealing with." Jennifer watched Robert's shoulders tense beneath his worn shirt. Something in his posture changed, subtle but unmistakable. It was the stance of a man who had faced down death before and lived to tell about it. "I know exactly who I'm dealing with," Robert replied, taking a measured step forward. "A coward who preys on women." The outlaw's face contorted with rage. "You're a dead man," he growled, adjusting his grip on the firearm. Mary whimpered softly, and Jennifer reached for her hand, squeezing it tight. She couldn't tear her eyes away from Robert's back, broad and unwavering, as he faced down the armed man. In that moment, she realized the rancher was willing to die for them, two strangers he'd found broken in the tall grass. The air in the small wooden house grew thick with tension. Outside, the Texas wind howled against the walls, but inside, time seemed to stand still as two men faced each other, one fueled by cruelty, the other by something Jennifer couldn't yet name. The outlaw's finger twitched against the trigger. Last chance to hand them over, peaceful-like. Robert didn't flinch. "There's only one way this ends where you walk out of here alive," he said quietly, "and that's with you turning around and leaving, alone." In a blur of movement that seemed impossible for a man of his build, Robert Davis lunged forward. His weathered hands, calloused from years of ranch work, closed around the outlaw's wrist with crushing force. The pistol twisted free with a single practiced motion, clattering across the wooden floorboards as Robert slammed the intruder against the wall. The impact knocked loose a cloud of dust from the rough-hewn planks. "You ain't welcome here," Robert growled, his voice low and dangerous as he pinned the man with his forearm pressed against the outlaw's throat. The rancher's eyes had changed. Gone was the quiet, reserved man who had rescued them from the plains. In his place stood someone else entirely, someone who moved with the deadly precision of a predator. The outlaw struggled and cursed, his face reddening as he clawed at Robert's arm. But the rancher didn't budge an inch. His stance was solid as oak, his breathing controlled despite the violence of the moment. Years of military discipline showed in every line of his body. Jennifer Smith watched the scene unfold, her breath caught in her throat. She had seen brutality during her captivity, had endured it firsthand, but this was different. Robert's actions weren't fueled by cruelty or rage. They were calculated, efficient, almost mechanical in their execution. The man who had offered them bread and shelter now revealed another side of himself, one forged in conflicts she could only imagine. Mary huddled in the corner, clutching her towel tightly against her chest, eyes wide with fear and something else. Hope, perhaps, that their nightmare might truly be ending. "I fought in battles you couldn't survive," Robert whispered to the outlaw, his words barely audible across the room. "Don't make me remember more than I already have to." With one final shove that made the wall timbers creak in protest, he propelled the man toward the door. The outlaw stumbled, catching himself against the doorframe before tumbling into the Texas dust outside. Robert stood framed in the doorway, his silhouette backlit by the warm glow of the lamplight within. "Tell your friends what you found here," he called after the retreating figure. "Tell them what happens when they come looking for trouble." As he closed the door and turned back to face them, Jennifer saw something in his eyes, a haunted quality that spoke of battlefields and lost comrades. In that moment, she understood that Robert Davis was far more than a simple rancher. He was a survivor, just as she was becoming. And survivors recognized each other in ways others never could. The outlaw stumbled backward, his mouth spewing curses that echoed through the small wooden house. Robert Davis stood firm, his weathered hands still clenched into fists, ready should the man try to lunge forward again. The rancher's stance spoke of years spent defending what was his, a posture forged in war and hardened by life on the Texas frontier. "You'll regret this," the outlaw snarled, spittle flying from his lips. "Michael doesn't forget, and he don't forgive." Robert stepped closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Neither do I." With one powerful shove, he sent the man tumbling through the doorway and into the yard. The outlaw landed hard in the dirt, dust billowing around his sprawled form. From inside, Jennifer Smith watched with wide eyes, her bruised wrists still throbbing from days of rope burns. She'd never seen someone handle an armed man with such controlled fury. The rancher hadn't even drawn his own weapon. He hadn't needed to. Mary Johnson clutched her filthy towel tighter around herself, trembling as she inched closer to the warmth of the fireplace. The dancing flames illuminated her battered face, highlighting the fear that still hadn't left her eyes despite their escape. "How did you do that?" Mary whispered, her voice barely audible over the crackling fire. Robert turned from the door, securing the latch with deliberate care. He merely shrugged, his broad shoulders rising and falling, as if ejecting an armed outlaw was nothing more remarkable than shooing away a persistent fly. "Some men only understand force," he said finally, moving to check the windows. His calloused fingers drew the threadbare curtains closed, sealing them away from the night. Jennifer noticed how his eyes never stopped scanning the horizon through gaps in the fabric. The rancher's apparent calm couldn't mask the tension in his jaw or the way his hand kept drifting toward the pistol at his hip. "He'll be back," she said, stating what they all knew. Robert nodded, pouring 3 cups of water from his dented canteen. Not alone, either. He handed the first cup to Mary, whose fingers trembled as she accepted it. "Michael's men are loyal to him. They'll come looking." The name hung in the air between them, though Jennifer and Mary didn't yet understand its significance. How the man who'd protected them shared blood with the monster who'd hunted them. Outside, the Texas night grew deeper. Robert moved a chair near the door and settled into it, his rifle across his lap. The danger was far from over. This had been merely the opening volley in what promised to be a bloody battle. As darkness enveloped the small ranch house, Robert knew that by morning, his brother would come to claim what he believed was his. Night settled over the ranch like a heavy blanket. Jennifer Smith helped Mary Johnson find a comfortable spot by the crackling fire, wrapping a worn blanket around her friend's shoulders. Mary's hands still trembled as she clutched a tin cup of hot coffee, her eyes darting nervously toward every shadow. "Try to rest," Jennifer whispered, gently squeezing Mary's arm. "You're safe now." The words felt hollow even as she spoke them, but she needed to believe them as much as Mary did. Across the room, Robert Davis stood at the window, his broad shoulders tense as he scanned the darkened Texas plains. The rancher hadn't relaxed since throwing the outlaw from his property. His weathered face remained impassive, but Jennifer could see the worry etched into every line. He knew what she knew. Humiliating a man like that would bring swift retribution. "They'll come back, won't they?" Jennifer asked, joining Robert at the window. He nodded once, his voice low. Michael never could stand losing face. Not even when we were boys. The admission of his connection to their tormentor hung in the air between them, unaddressed but impossible to ignore. Jennifer opened her mouth to question him further when the unmistakable sound of hooves pounding against hard earth cut through the night. Robert's hand moved instinctively to the pistol at his hip. "Get Mary to the back room," he ordered, his tone leaving no room for argument. Jennifer hurried Mary away from the fire, ignoring her frightened protests. Through the window, she counted 4 riders dismounting in the yard, their silhouettes black against the moonlit landscape. Each man carried a rifle slung across his back, pistols gleaming at their sides. The front door swung open without warning. No knock, no call, just the sudden intrusion of unwanted men into Robert's home. Jennifer held her breath as Michael Davis stepped inside, tall and menacing. The lamplight caught the jagged scar running from his eye to his jaw, making it appear deeper, more sinister than before. His eyes, so similar to Robert's, yet utterly different in their coldness, swept the room before settling on his brother. The family resemblance was unmistakable, now that Jennifer knew to look for it. the same strong jaw, the same set of the shoulders. But where Robert's eyes held warmth, Michael's burned with something dangerous. "Evening, brother," Michael said, his voice slow and deliberate, each word weighted with threat. His men filed in behind him, hands hovering near their weapons. Robert stood his ground, feet planted firmly on the wooden floorboards of his home. "You're not welcome here, Michael." Michael's lips curved into a smile that never reached his eyes. "Now, is that any way to greet family?" "Hand them over, brother," Michael demanded, his voice low and heavy. Jennifer's head snapped toward Robert, understanding dawning in her eyes as she realized the man hunting them was his kin. The word brother hung in the air like gun smoke. Jennifer felt her stomach twist into knots as the pieces fell into place. The rancher who had saved them, offered them shelter and protection, shared blood with the very monster who had tormented them. Her eyes darted between the two men, searching for similarities she'd somehow missed. Robert Davis stood tall, shoulders squared against the doorframe. The lamplight cast long shadows across his weathered face, highlighting the same jawline, the same set of the eyes as the outlaw leader. But where Michael's gaze burned with cruel intention, Robert's remained steady and resolute. "Michael," he replied wearily, "you always thought the world owed you more. I couldn't stop you then, but I'll stop you now." Mary Johnson cowered behind Jennifer, clutching her filthy towel like armor. The young woman's breathing came in shallow gasps, her eyes wide with renewed terror as she recognized her captor. Jennifer instinctively moved in front of her friend, despite knowing how futile the gesture might be against armed men. Michael's fingers tapped against his holstered pistol, the scar on his cheek twisting as he sneered. "Family loyalty doesn't mean much to you anymore, does it, Rob?" He gestured toward the women with his chin. "These two are my property, nothing more." "They're people," Robert countered, his voice quiet but firm. "Not cattle. Not prizes." The outlaws behind Michael shifted uneasily, rifles glinting in the dim light. One spat tobacco juice onto the wooden floor, deliberately marking the rancher's home. Jennifer noticed how Robert's eyes flicked toward the gesture, but returned immediately to his brother's face, refusing to be baited. "The war changed you," Michael said, taking a step forward. "Made you soft. The war showed me what men become when they forget their humanity," Robert answered. "Look at yourself, Michael. This isn't who our father raised us to be." The room crackled with tension, everyone poised on a knife's edge. Jennifer could feel Mary trembling behind her, could hear the shallow, frightened breaths of her friend. She reached back, finding Mary's hand and squeezing it tightly, a silent promise that whatever happened next, they would face it together. Outside, a horse whinnied in the darkness. The wind rattled the windows of the simple wooden house. Inside, two brothers stood divided by choices that could never be unmade, with two women's lives hanging in the balance between them. The metallic gleam of pistols caught the lamplight as tension filled the small wooden house. Jennifer Smith's heart pounded in her chest as she instinctively moved closer to Mary, ready to shield her friend despite her own trembling limbs. The outlaws stood with hands hovering over their weapons, eager for bloodshed. She braced herself for the inevitable gunfire, the final chapter of their nightmare. But Robert Davis surprised everyone. Instead of reaching for his own firearm, he stepped forward deliberately, his weathered boots creaking against the floorboards. His eyes, hard as Texas flint, locked onto his brother's gaze with unwavering intensity. "Michael," Robert said, his voice carrying the weight of their shared past. The rancher stood tall, shoulders squared, a man who had faced death before and wasn't afraid to do so again. The outlaw leader's scarred face twitched with barely contained fury. His men shifted nervously, unsure whether to draw their weapons without a direct command. "Look at yourself," Robert continued, voice steady as a river current. "You were a soldier once. We both were. We fought for something greater than ourselves." He gestured toward the women with a calloused hand. Is this what you want to be remembered for? Selling women like cattle?" The words hung in the air, sharp as broken glass. For a moment, something flickered across Michael's face, a shadow of the man he once was, before the war had twisted him into this hollow version of himself. Jennifer watched the exchange with bated breath. The resemblance between the brothers was suddenly unmistakable. The same strong jaw, the same piercing eyes. But where Robert's gaze held compassion beneath the steel, his brothers had grown cold and distant. Mary clutched Jennifer's arm, her fingers digging into flesh as she whispered, "What's happening?" The outlaw leader's hand tightened around his pistol, knuckles white with strain. For one terrible moment, Jennifer was certain he would pull the trigger, ending his brother's life right before their eyes. But something in Robert's words had struck a chord. Pain flickered in Michael's eyes, brief but unmistakable, a crack in his hardened exterior. The scar on his cheek seemed to deepen as his expression contorted with inner conflict. One of Michael's men spat on the floor. "Just shoot him and take the women," he growled. But Michael silenced him with a single glance. The lamplight cast long shadows across the room as brother faced brother, their silhouettes stretching across the walls like figures from an ancient tale of betrayal. The air between them was charged with unspoken history, battles fought together, promises broken, and paths that had diverged into opposite directions. Jennifer held her breath, watching the silent war raging behind Michael's eyes. Whatever happened next would determine all their fates. The pistol in Michael Davis's hand glinted menacingly in the lamplight as he aimed it directly at his brother's chest. Jennifer Smith felt her heart stop, a scream catching in her throat. She lunged forward instinctively, but Mary's trembling hand held her back. Robert stood perfectly still, his weathered face betraying no fear. The years of battle had taught him to stare death in the eye without flinching. The silence in the small wooden house grew thick enough to cut with a knife. "If you're going to spill blood tonight, let it be mine," Robert said, his voice barely above a whisper, yet carrying the weight of steel. But the girls stay. Jennifer watched the two brothers, so different yet unmistakably kin. The same jaw, the same stance. One man using his strength to protect, the other to destroy. The scar on Michael's face seemed to pulse with each heartbeat, a physical manifestation of the darkness within him. Michael's finger twitched on the trigger. One of his men shifted uncomfortably, boots scraping against the wooden floor. Outside, a horse whinnied in the Texas night, the sound cutting through the tension like a knife. "You always were stubborn," Michael finally said, his slow, deliberate words filling the room. "Always thought you were better than me." Robert didn't respond, just kept his eyes locked on his brothers. Jennifer held her breath, watching this silent battle of wills between blood relations. Mary's fingers dug into her arm, her entire body trembling with fear. After what seemed like eternity, Michael lowered his weapon. Something passed between the brothers. A look, a memory, perhaps a flicker of what once was. The outlaw leader turned to his men with a jerk of his head. "We're done here," he muttered, holstering his pistol. The other outlaws exchanged glances, clearly surprised by their leader's retreat. One by one, they filed out of the rancher's home, spurs jingling with each step. Jennifer felt hope rising in her chest, a dangerous, fragile thing she hadn't dared feel in days. At the doorway, Michael paused. The lamplight cast half his face in shadow, the scar a dark line dividing him. He turned back toward his brother, eyes narrowed to slits. "This isn't over," he whispered. Words dripping with venom. Not by a long shot. Then he was gone, swallowed by the darkness beyond the door. The sound of hooves faded into the distance as the outlaws rode away. But Jennifer knew with bone-deep certainty that Michael's words were not empty threats. Robert remained standing, shoulders rigid, until the last echo of hoofbeats disappeared. Only then did he allow himself to exhale, the weight of what had just transpired visible in every line of his body. Robert closed the door with a heavy sigh, his shoulders sagging under the weight of his decision. The confrontation with Michael had left him hollow inside. Blood turning against blood was something he'd witnessed in war, but never expected in his own family. He glanced at Jennifer and Mary huddled by the fire, their faces illuminated by the dancing flames. "Will they come back?" Jennifer Smith asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Not tonight," Robert replied, moving to stoke the fire. "But tomorrow's another story." The women slept fitfully on makeshift beds, while the rancher kept vigil by the window, pistol at his side. As dawn painted the Texas plains in gold, Mary Johnson announced her decision. "I need to find what's left of my family," she said, clutching her tattered towel. "After everything, I need to know they're safe." Jennifer embraced her friend, tears streaming down both their faces. Their shared ordeal had forged a bond deeper than words could express. Robert provided Mary with provisions, a horse, and directions to the nearest town. "Thank you," Mary whispered to him, her eyes conveying what words couldn't. As she mounted the horse, she turned to Jennifer one last time. "You saved my life out there." Jennifer squeezed her hand. "We saved each other." They watched Mary ride away, a small figure growing smaller against the vast horizon. When she disappeared from view, Jennifer turned to Robert. "I have nowhere to go," she admitted. "Then stay," he offered simply. The days stretched into weeks. Jennifer's physical wounds began to heal, though the nightmares persisted. She found purpose in helping around the ranch, feeding animals, mending fences, cooking meals. Robert taught her to ride and shoot, skills that brought her a sense of security she'd never known before. They spoke little of Michael, though his threat hung over them like a storm cloud. Occasionally, Robert would catch Jennifer watching the horizon with fearful eyes. "He won't take you again," he promised one evening as they sat on the porch. "Not while I'm breathing." Jennifer nodded, studying his weathered face. "Why did you help us that night? You didn't know us." Robert was silent for a long moment. "Maybe I was helping myself too," he finally said. As summer faded into fall, something quiet and unspoken grew between them, a connection built on shared danger and mutual respect. It wasn't love, not yet, but it carried the promise of something that might one day heal them both. In the harsh Texas frontier, where survival itself was victory, they had found something unexpected: redemption and the possibility of beginning again.